Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
Come on, sit down. Just give you a few seconds just to kind of realise what's going on. You have the chat box, so please say hello. We have questions as well on the right-hand side of the chat box, so that if you want to ask us any questions throughout, you can use the questions box there. There's some polls in there for you to click on, just some to help me with where you found this webinar from. And that's pretty much it. You should be able to see myself, Emily Overton, and also the beautiful face that is Scott Salmons, and also our slides. So if you could let us know that you can see all three, that would be great. We've got a lot of people dialing in from either a sunny place or a cloudy place. Fab, thank you very much for confirming.
Well, it's kind of a blend between the two. It wants to be sunny, but it's very cloudy at the moment.
Yeah, it's very cloudy here in London. Oh, it's so British, isn't it? Talking about the weather.
Oh, it's raining for Inga.
Oh dear. She's not that far from me either. Don't send it this way. A network error. I'm not sure what that's about. This is being recorded and will be available afterwards. The question is where? I've got to convince my web dev that he wants to upload an hour-long video to my website. Or it'll be YouTube, one or two. Okay, Scott, are we ready to go?
I'm ready when you are.
Well, welcome everybody. We took this opportunity to talk about track and trace and the records that you need to be having in the event that you're asked for them, but also to have a think about the data protection implications. Now, the question about whether you're asked for them is something that we'll explore throughout this webinar, because we're going off the guidance that the government have given. And Scott, would you say it's a bit sketchy or vague, to say the least?
Just a little bit. Well, it's mainly written, a lot of the guidance is written. So I've spent the last week or so reading all of the guidance from the government, from the Department of Health and Social Care, from the Health and Safety Executive, from the NHS, from various different sources. And a lot of it is written as if it's talking to you as a citizen, not talking to you as an employer or as a business owner or those sorts of things. So while the guidance is good at explaining how track and trace works and what the expectations are, voluntary expectations, I might add, of citizens, when it comes to then, well, what should a business do with regards to track and trace, apart from some specific things around what they need from you, like name, address, that sort of stuff, and some loose references to 21 days retention. That's it, really. It doesn't really then tell you, well, what happens? Do they ring you? Do you ring them? Do you do this? Do you do that?
Should we just close the webinar off now? There you go, guys. That's the information. No. Okay. So if my slides would move on, that would be great. Okay. So who's Emily? It's me. I am RM Girl. I've been doing records management for nearly 15 years. And I'm fundamentally a very sad person because I find talking about records management interesting both in a personal capacity and also business. I actually had to find a hobby when someone asked me what my hobby was. Apparently records management isn't the answer you should give. So yes, I am doing it as records management girl, as my business. And yes, so that you'll recognize our faces from RMS, but we are speaking on our own terms today under our own businesses. That's me. How about you?
So I've worked in information governance for 11, well over 11 years now. Started off in social care or health and social care, and then went independent in April of 2018.
I've
And since then, I've been working with all sorts of organisations. So I've got a partnership with the Essex Chambers of Commerce, and I'm doing a series of webinars with them on things like back to work, track and trace, that sort of stuff, to support local Essex businesses. And yeah, it's been quite fascinating coming at it from a different point of view and looking at data protection and wider information governance things from all sorts of different angles. So my little disclaimer is that I'm talking on behalf of me and none of my partnerships.
I went self-employed just before Scott in October 2017 and then told him how amazing it was. I didn't plan for COVID though. Oh, sorry, Scott. So when it comes to information records management, the amount of things that people think that it actually applies to is just filing. But I'm here to tell you more about that today. About it being the golden thread throughout your organization is that if you take, wow, we've got someone commenting quite large amounts of information. Interesting. We'll come on to that shortly. But yeah, the golden thread throughout your organization, the start and the end point of where you're creating data from and where it's ending. But one of the things that we wanted to look at was combining data protection and also records management together to make sure that where we give you information, it's with data protection in mind. So I'll just get Scott to go through this and then we'll talk more about the life cycle shortly.
So what we're going to do is, as we talk about the life cycle of records, I'm going to link in the relevant parts and the relevant considerations you'll need to consider with regards to the principles. So I'll mainly focus on those and the things that organisations can do to make it a little bit simpler, but also some of the things where, as we've been talking about already, and as Lynn's pointed out, there are some guidance that's coming out that's specific, but also some areas where it might be a little bit vague. Therefore, what you can do to try and simplify it as much as possible. What are major academic concerns and what are major actual practical concerns? So we'll go through those as well. So for those of you that don't know what the 7 principles are or don't have much of an experience with them, we're going to look at the principle of fairness, lawfulness and transparency, what the government is saying around what your grounds of processing are under principle 1, steps that you can take and some of the issues that it's presenting around now that organisations are probably collecting in more than what they would ever have done before. What that means in terms of purpose limitation, not letting people get their grubby little mitts on it for other things like marketing and stuff like that, not being creepy or as being as less intrusive as possible. Principle number 3, how the problems that it throws up around accuracy, because again, there is no requirement at the moment to verify in any way. It's kind of implied, but some bits of this you'll just have to rely on a little bit of trust, especially if you're just a restaurant as opposed to someone like a university or someone like that, when you relatively know who's on campus and who isn't. Security, retention, which Emily's obviously going to talk about, so I won't really talk about that too much, and the accountability stuff that, again, where the ICO has said that they are going to take a flexible approach to when things go wrong regarding COVID-19 and track and tracing, there are some things they still expect you to do and some bare minimums that you're expected to do. So we'll go through some of that as well.
So when it comes to records management, one of the things that I actually say is that sorry about that. And one of the things that I say is that you can't do data protection without records management. I believe that how are you supposed to know what you've got, why you've got it, and how long you need to keep it when you are doing exactly that for data protection? So if you don't know those 3 questions, which are the main basic requirements of records management, then what are you doing? Because if you don't know that, then you don't know about data protection. So with our slides, we have been trying to bring these together, both the topics, because it's very difficult to kind of separate them out. So you'll see the slides going through various different moments talking about records management and also data protection, but in some situations they'll be the same subject just crossing over, and we'll try not to have a bun fight over who talks about that particular topic.
We all know I'd lose, let's be honest. So let's start with the basics of what is expected. So for those of you that don't know, as part of the lifting of the restrictions and for more and more organisations and businesses to open up from the 4th of July, one of the conditions of that is that certain organisations that do bring the public onto their property, either through bars and restaurants, cinemas, universities, those sorts of things, a part of that is that they will keep a record of who attends their property and at what times. So in the government's advice on support for businesses, for restaurants, pubs, bars, takeaway services, and some other parts of their guidance on the COVID-19 area, it talks about the logic behind it, what citizens can expect, references the 21 days, and adds in some detail around what you would need. So name and some sort of contact details. As Lynn's pointed out in the comments, there have been some sectors where they have clarified that somewhat, whereas at the moment the official guidance on the Department of Health and Social Care website or the government's main COVID website doesn't go into that level of detail, which is annoying and unhelpful. But as Lynn's pointed out, the library service, or what they've got through the libraries through Leicester City Council, has been quite useful. And the stuff that's on there has been quite useful. So I've just written some of that down and I'll refer back to that because that makes sense. And it's kind of what we've all been thinking and what the guidance from central government seems to imply, but doesn't explicitly state. So I'm quite glad that there have been some areas like libraries where they have already said, no, this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to work. That's kind of what we want.
It kind of feels like they're relying on people to make up their own processes because as Scott and I were having a discussion earlier, is that I was going on what was implied and he was saying, no, that's not what they're saying. This is what they're saying. You can only go on what they're actually saying. So there's a question as to where the libraries have got that information from, like where has it actually come from? But it does look very sensible advice. So, Scott.
There are, from the guidance and from the programme that's been launched by the government, it would appear that there are two main purposes for you collecting personal data. Number one, keeping a record of that customer's visit. Second is then sharing it with NHS Track and Trace, because it could be that for your particular organisation, you're keeping a record of who came in and when, how and why for the 21 days, and that doesn't go anywhere. You don't get any reports on the Track and Trace. That never happens. It's just a record that you keep, and then once all this has passed, you don't have any interaction with the Track and Trace programme whatsoever. So your first base process is to keep a register of that. Secondly is then the onward sharing. So if, as we all assume, the NHS Track and Trace service contacts you to say someone has identified that they were on your premises at a particular point, we would like information on who else was there during that period, then it'll be sharing with the NHS Track and Trace service for them to then contact those individuals directly. Based on what Lynn's put in there and based on what we can find online, it doesn't look like there's any expectation for you to contact them. So for you to contact the people that were in your premises. Instead, the Track and Trace service will do that for you. But again, it's one of those areas where it doesn't explicitly say. Therefore, it's very much a working assumption that that's how it'll work.
And as Ashley has just said in the chat just there about it being a RID or reportable disease, sharing information in relation to reportable diseases is obviously okay. So just have a think about why you're actually collecting the data. But these are the main two. Want to say Scott?
Yep. One of the bit of advice, if you move on to the next slide, one of the bit of advice that came out from the Track and Trace system is for employers to be careful about who rings them, because they will say, this is the number that it's calling from, this is what we'll do, and this is what we'll ask. So the guidance that's for citizens, or that has been written for citizens about how they'll be contacted, it's just as good, or assuming, again, it's just as good, because the guidance doesn't say, because it's explicitly written for citizens, that this is how it will work and this is what's what. So if you want to understand more about how the process works, what could be an authentic call rather than someone trying to blag you for information, have a look at that, the link that's up on your screen now, and you can see details about the number that they'll call from, how the process will work, those sorts of things. And at the moment, that's the general assumption, is that that's how it will work for organisations as well. So don't just believe anyone that rings up and says, "Hi, I'm from the NHS track and trace system. Can you give me this?" Do make sure that you verify it, so it's not just giving out willy-nilly.
Someone pointed out is that Linda is saying is that we are looking at the English scheme. Some of you guys don't live there. That is correct, is that we are looking at England and Wales. So on to the life cycle part of it that I wanted to look at. I use this image quite a bit. It's something that I drew myself. My mum would be very proud. I look at information as a conveyor belt, and what we're looking at today, obviously track and trace, is that we're following through this life cycle of where we create it, where we use it, where we store it, and where we review it and then eventually dispose, if it can just go into confidential waste, or as you can see, the claw on the screen is, would it go to archive? Records sit on various different conveyor belts for different periods of time, but since we're talking only about track and trace and the records that you need to keep as a business, there's only one retention period here that we'll bring up later. Obviously, records can be pulled from storage and sent back into use, or can be reviewed and sent back into storage, but once they're destroyed or deleted, they're gone. So you really need to make informed decisions on what you're doing. The thing is that when you're looking at creation, create something that you don't need to add to later on, because say for instance you only start taking down someone's name and it's their first name, but then realize, oh no, we've got too many John Smiths in this business. We need to identify exactly who John Smith is, but the problem is those people have already been and gone, so you need to think about how you create your spreadsheet or Word document or however you're going to do it right at the very beginning, before you roll it out, before you open up. So when we look at creation, the slides aren't behaving. Unfortunately, I appear to be having a very slow going moment. Scott tells me this is something Mac related, which is interesting, to say the least. So when you're opening up, you need to think about what you're going to write down, and when you write it down, what you're writing down. Think about the integrity. Are you going to be covering everybody? How many entries and exits to your building do you have? Are you able to get the information on a system in one go? So, for example, I assume a museum will only have one entry, but a university will have multiple entries. Should you be closing off those entries so that your method of collection of data is appropriate? And you can say that, yes, everybody on this list is everybody who was on the premise at any one date, as opposed to only having one entry point with a collection of data available. You also need to look at availability. Where are you storing the data, and can everybody access it that needs to? And by that, I mean, do you have staff who have logins to computers that can open up a shared file? If not, is it going to work? Or are you going to designate certain people are going to have this collection? It's difficult to say really sort of what is the best as to whether it's electronic or paper. Clearly in the comments Lynn said about electronics preferred, but what happens if you don't have that kind of situation? What happens if you, I can't imagine that a restaurant will give all of their waitresses and barmaid people laptops to actually access this spreadsheet. So we need to have a think, really, how is it going to work? Also, confidentiality. Are your staff aware of not sharing information with people who do not need to know in their business? So having a gossip about seeing who was in the pub during a certain time with certain people. This information could give a lot of data to the wrong person if they're not aware of it. So an example is how many times someone's visiting the pub. Are they suffering from alcoholism? You know, sort of like they've been there all day and they drank a lot of pints and you saw them, but also they came in the next day as well. And what about the 5 days previous? That 21 days activity of someone visiting. Oh, and they visited with someone who wasn't their wife. Is it something that's going on that shouldn't be? It's not to be discussed outside your business. It is literally just for tracking and tracing for COVID. Scott.
One of the key starting points, and this is some really good guidance from the health and safety executive, is to start with your risk assessment. So as part of your reopening up as part of COVID-19, or expanding your opening if you've been open already, is to complete a health and safety risk assessment on how you can implement the 2 metre or 1 metre social distancing rules, how you can do cleaning, how you can do crowd control, all those sorts of things. So some of the points that Emily raised there around, for example, the data collection points, if you're using paper-based records, it could be that actually if you decide that you are on your particular site, you do have multiple entry points, and you've actually decided that from a health and safety point of view, you're actually going to limit it down to a handful, say 2 or 3, fine, that kind of answers some of the data collection points for you. So, for example, here in Essex, I live relatively near the Lakeside Shopping Centre that has 15 entrance and exits across all the stores and across the main shopping centre itself. What they've decided to do is actually limit that down to 4. And again, 1 is an exit, 1 is an entry, and it's crowd controlled, etc. So for them, they've limited the number of people. That way, then they can A, limit the number of people in the store at any given time, and B, can then herd people in the right directions because there are a limited number of people there. So again, your starting point should be your risk assessment and go from there. The next thing is then to look at, okay, well, to the couple of the comments that were in there about reporting by exception and stuff like that. So, okay, well, what sort of organisation am I? Is it a case of something that I'm a university, therefore I know roughly what people are on campus at any given time? Am I a small restaurant? Am I a pub? Am I whatever? And then responding accordingly. Because some organisations, emphasis on some, will be doing some of this already. Who's on premises and who isn't, either for fire safety purposes, or if they're a restaurant, they've already got a booking system. Those sorts of things where you can try and utilise those systems as much as possible. So again, it's not as far as possible, and it keeps it as simple as you can. If you can't, because it's just not geared for that, it just doesn't work, fine. But at least look at that first. At least that way, then that's some of your problems that might disappear. So coming back to Emily's point earlier on, remember that while it might be, or the way on where the ICO has said it's relatively lawful, and there is a lawful way for you to go about doing it, you need to look at the other things in place to make it fair. So again, training staff to be clear that they can't just use it willy-nilly, because that's not fair to the customers. Not telling them what you're using it for, those sorts of things. They're all things that can help with that fairness and help with the impact of what it means to your customers. And again, from a customer service point of view, also means they're a little bit more inclined to A, trust you, B, work with you, rather than work against you, because again, you're not just doing it because you have to and doing the bare minimum. You're actually doing what you need to do. You're being clear and transparent with them, those sorts of things. So what the ICO said, if you move on, what the ICO has said is that if you're going to keep lists of name contact details, then that's what the ICO has put forward are considerations around what your grants of processing would be. They've not gone down, and this has been explored by a few people, they've not gone down the consent route. Instead, they've gone down making a strong argument for legitimate interests and saying that from Article 6, rather than doing consent, legal obligation, because it's not a legal mandatory requirement at the moment, instead they're going down the route of saying legitimate interests. So let's follow that logic then. If you move on the next one.
I wish it was quicker. Sorry. Thank you.
Skip to the next one then. then when you're doing a legitimate interest, and again, there won't be, while there might be some examples knocking around of things that you could use. Again, it's going to be unique to you, your setup, your working, the systems that you use, and the issues that you face. Remember that your legitimate interest test has to look at three key things. So, is it appropriate that A, you open up and that you are back open to members of the public, and that you have to have them on premises? You can't do things like takeaway services or those sorts of things where exposure to you and customers to other customers is reduced. So is it appropriate that you have them on premises and that customers will be exposed to other customers? If that is the case, that is a legitimate thing for you to do. You are a legitimate business, therefore you are legitimately opening up using the trace and track system to be able to open up. You could make that argument. That's a reasonable argument to make. Is it necessary to store this data and use it in this way? And again, a lot of it will depend on the how. So if you're keeping the bare minimum, and we'll talk about what the bare minimum is a little bit later on, but you're keeping the bare minimum, you're keeping it secure, you're not using it for clever marketing reasons and all those different things. You're literally saying, right, in order for me to open, I need to collect this, therefore I'm going to collect the bare minimum and look after it. You could make that argument as well. Therefore, on balance, given that the public know about the track and trace system, there is a pandemic on at the moment, and that the public expect or think that it's reasonable for organisations to open up, providing there are other COVID-19 controls in place, social distancing, clean hands, antiseptic spray, blah, blah, all that other stuff combining together. If your risk assessment says that you can open and you've got appropriate controls in place, then the balancing test for your legitimate interests would say the same thing. And again, that's something you could explain to your customers as well. Turn it into a, look, we are opening up, or we need to open up because otherwise we'll go under. This is what we're looking to do. This is how we're looking to work. We do need your help in order to do this. Support us as a business and we'll support you as a customer. Those sorts of things. That way then you could make a strong argument that it is balanced and that you're doing what you can. Yes, I've got to track, I've got to use this stuff as part of the trace and track stuff, but I'm doing what I can to look after it. I'm doing what I can to minimize the impact to individuals to it. Now with that, if you move on to the next slide.
Before we move on, Scott, we do have a question that I think would be good to answer because it's been upvoted a couple of times. It's to do with registering as a data controller if not already, e.g. my local isn't tied to a brewery.
So because there's no set deadline on when this will stop, that this could go on to the end of the year, which is a good six plus months. Now, registration with the ICO is an annual process. The ICO hasn't given any advice as to what they expect registration to be. I would make the argument that if you're just a one incident local, so you're just one entity, and the most number of personal data you're going to have is what, say 300, 500. I don't want to put a set amount on it because that's always very context based, but it's going to be relatively low. I would make the argument for not registering because again, it's temporary, short term, but then on the flip side, it costs you 30 quid. So if you are a small organization that's never registered before, you've got low levels of personal data, it's not sensitive personal data, it's currently not being seen as special category data, then it's going to cost you 40 quid. So, and if you just do it for the year and then don't register again, it's going to be no major skin off your nose. So my advice would be do it, cover your bases. Don't do it, there's no major reason to.
Very good, very good fence sitting there. This is unfortunately a problem that we're having to look at, is where we're not being given guidance by the right people. So the ICO hasn't said that you need to register, is that we're having to question what are the reasons behind registering, and can you make an argument for why you shouldn't? If you can make an argument, then it would be something it's worthwhile possibly calling the ICO themselves, because that way you're getting it from the horse's mouth.
And some, to Craig's point, some of them, and again, this is where it's going to be very context based, that if you're a small pub or a small organisation where you've got like 5 members of staff, stuff like that, where you've probably crept under the radar or not quite met the requirements, then there are benefits to doing it. There are benefits to staying where you are. Whereas if you had an online system, you deal with 100 or thousands of customers a year, then you probably should have been doing it anyway. So again, I come back to my point of I see no harm in doing it.
And I'm inclined to agree, Scott, is that I tend to go on the side of it's better to spend 40 quid and know that you're not going to be in trouble than have to sit there spending hours and hours working out your argument that you shouldn't do it. Just pay it, and then just don't pay it next year when you're not having to do it. And as Inga says in the chat as well, is that surely they have staff anyway, so they would need to register. Okay.
So again, it's going to be a real eclectic mix. So I lean towards, I know I'm kind of sitting on the fence on this, but I lean towards doing it.
Yeah, same here.
I do it. I register when I don't need to. Some of the organisations that I've volunteered at, they've registered when they don't need to. So I favour registering.
So obviously we took a swerve out there to answer that question. Just want to go back now. Sorry, Scott. Here's your
So with that, so where you are using your grounds of processing as legitimate interests, for example, there are some things that come with it. Specifically, I want to talk about some of the other rights as well, because we've kind of slotted them into appropriate points. But one of the biggest ones is the right to object. Because again, if you're putting forward your legitimate reasons why you can do it on the counterpoint, people can object to that and say no. And again, this is why it's really important that for you, your organisation, the way that you do it and the way you're looking to work, if you've got a strong argument and you've done that assessment, that adds to your strong argument for not honouring or looking to exempt yourself from an objection request. Whereas if you haven't done that, you've just copied and pasted what someone else wrote and it's got nothing to do with you at all, it just looked good, then again, someone could quite easily contest that and say not. So again, see what's what.
So when we're looking at the creation of a document that needs to hold this data, how are you going to create it? You need to plan out what you're going to be looking for and the kinds of data. And I was questioning sort of with Scott about what people would actually be able to record and by what methods. And I can imagine somebody trying to go down the CCTV route. It says, but CCTV isn't going to be good enough to recognize somebody. You might not know every person's face in there, so you're going to have to get their name and their contact details because you don't know where everybody lives in your local village. So going on a template format and having somebody man the door for when they come in seems to be the best appropriate plan. However you do it, whether it's on Word, Excel, a booking system that you've used for restaurants bookings before, or printouts. How are you going to do it? Just try and make it as infallible as possible. And it's easy to complete. How to create, as you say, pen and paper. But the thing that I would say is that to ensure that you're going to get the same data for everybody and that any staff coming onto shift know what they're going to write down is that you have specific headed parts on this paper so that they can be filled out. With this in mind, Scott.
So this is where the general rule of what do you actually need. So as Lynn pointed out earlier on, at the very basic minimum that everyone that's going to use this program to open up with will be name, contact details, date and time of their period. The period of them arriving. Not quite sure why I said that, but hey. So I arrived, I went to the pub at this date and time, I was here during this time, and this is my email address as an example. And that's it. That could be for everyone, that's what you're going to, the minimum that you would need. Anything else isn't necessary, isn't required for the track and trace program, isn't required for this particular purpose. If you're collecting other things because you are, I don't know, a restaurant or a library, whatever, and you're then using it to manage their visit, so what books they want, what table they want, all that other stuff, that's separate. But for the purposes of purely track and trace, this is the bare minimum that you need. So collecting anything else, I would ask yourself the serious question, or ask the business a serious question of, what is that for? What does that relate to? Why are we collecting that for this purpose? Or is it for something else? If it's for something else, we'll look at that. But for this purpose, what is it? That way then, when you're being clear and transparent with people, next slide, and you're being transparent with what they require, what's going on, those sorts of things. If you're creating the policy document, so if we do think that we do then end up collecting sensitive special category data, I still call it sensitive personal data because I grew up on the old act, so you know I'm stubborn like that. Then again, in your policy document, being clear with that as to what you do and how you're working with it and why you only collect the bare minimum. So it could be quite likely that you go nowhere near special category personal data. Who knows? It's an unpredictable situation, so no one really knows. Explaining what you do, how you do it, being clear with them how it all works. So again, you're buying in some of that trust from your customers as well. To say, look, we want to come and support you, we want to buy your product, eat your linguine, whatever. Therefore, it makes sense for it to be a little bit of toing and froing. So once you know what it is you've got or what you need for that purpose, again, as part of that, and we'll talk about access a little bit later on, make sure that you do outline as part of your privacy notice and as part of that separate policy document. And that policy document could literally be as simple as, this is what we do your data. Everything we've talked about today, this is the life cycle of it. This is why we use it. This is what the government said. This is where you can go for further information on track and trace. This is what we will do if someone contacts us. This is what you can expect us to hand over to the track and trace program. This is what we rely on you to give us accurately, so that it does for those sorts of reasons. This is how we store it. So we only keep paper records. The manager gets rid of them at the end of the day, whatever it might be. It's all in there. It's a nice explanation of what it is that you do. It doesn't have to be this legalistic document. It can just be a plain and simple, plain English from start to finish. This is how we work, and this is why we rely on you, the customer, to do this and this for us, those sorts of things. So next slide. So remember who you are. So if you are part of a brewery, is the brewery collecting, or are you collecting it on behalf of the brewery, or is it part of you because you are the entity, whatever it might be, why you're collecting it. So again, the two purposes: to keep a record of your visit and then share with the track and trace program, nothing else. I would make the argument as well to not go down the marketing route, trying to get a marketing consent at the same time as this. Just don't do it. For all sorts of reasons, it's a bad idea. I know that some people try and make the argument for it, and legally, if you're providing you've got a separate consent and you've done it in accordance with PECA and all that other jazz, there's nothing stopping you. But from an ethical point of view and from a customer service point of view, it just stinks of a bad idea. So just don't do it. Avoid it at all costs. That does then throw up some issues around. So if you move on to the next one. Some issues around accuracy. So one of the things that have been highlighted already, and I think it was Tim Turner in one of his blog posts that ended up in the New Scientist magazine, pointed out that because this isn't a legal requirement program and there's no customers, citizens to report certain things, it's just kind of, the phrase they use is expected, but it's not legally required. Then at the moment, the requirement around verifying what someone says to you is a little bit vague as well. So if you've got an online system, customers book online, book their table online, whatever it might be, then if it verifies their email address, fine, I've got a verified email address. It kind of job done. Whereas if someone rocks up at your restaurant or books on your restaurant in the old-fashioned analog way, and Lynn's point calls themselves Dominic Cummings, you could challenge it and say, we really do need an actual name from you. I've got your telephone number because, oh, look, you rung me and there's the number right there. But in terms of the name, or Matt Hancock, yes, yeah, I have to admit, I was tempted to do that myself. Again, there's the how far you go to enforce that and demand an actual contact name. Again, if you've got their email address, again, if someone phones in and your phone system displays the telephone number, you could use that. So they could call themselves Mini McMoose It doesn't matter because I've got a telephone number for them. Again, I know that these people were in my, because again, when the contract tracer people contact you, they'll say, this person was in your restaurant. They've said they came on this day. Can you see what's what? If they appear, fine. If they don't appear, because they declare themselves as their actual name, whereas they gave you Minnie McMoose, then you've got a problem. So if you wanted to say, I'm not going to serve you, or I'm not going to allow your booking without a genuine name, because it's in my legitimate interest to have it, and I want to refuse service on that basis, purely for make a health and safety argument, then you could do so. As Craig's pointed out, but if you, the data controller, have to ensure that data accuracy under Principle 4, they need to ensure the data is accurate. So why wouldn't verification be mandatory? Because again, I can book a dinner table right now and call myself whatever I like. Again, there's no requirement for them to verify who I am. There is a strong argument for doing so because of the track and trace program. Therefore, you could refuse service on the basis of them not giving you any sort of degree of verification. But what verification do you want? Are you going to get in things like passports, driving licenses, all those sorts of things? It's just not feasible, not practical. Organizations aren't going to be willing to do that, and citizens aren't going to be willing to hand over that sort of information to verify who they are. So you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So in terms of balancing what's practical, and again, there's a difference here between what is legal versus what is practical. On a practical sense, again, look at what's proportionate. To Ashley's point, what's proportionate? What is relevant for your organization? If you know that you've got a very small restaurant and you're very heavily reliant on the track and trace program, I think you could make a strong argument for refusing service for those that give you an obviously dodgy name. Things like that. Again, it's going to be very context based, very specific to each organization, your risks, your obligations, the problems that you.
There's something to be said about the verification of the data around the proportionate side of that. You have people in trans community and non-binary. Are you really going to make them give you driving license to share that information and to potentially out themselves? Is that really appropriate? And if they don't give you their ID, what happens if they haven't got an ID? Like, not everybody has a passport, not everybody has a driving license. Do you have to bring in a council tax bill for the data in the last 3 months? It gets a bit daft. And I feel that if you explain why you're taking the data down, and obviously all your purposes, because you want to make sure people are safe, is that should give people a good indication for giving you the right name. So if you're honest and transparent and telling people why you're taking the information, and you're upfront about it from the very start, and you don't do anything creepy with it, such as we've been talking about, and or try and swing any marketing in with it, if you're literally doing it because you want to reopen your business, then I think people will be much more willing to give an actual name rather than something fake, because fake names usually come out of a fear of something happening to the data. So make sure you look after the data and that you only use it for what you meant to, and we should be looking at near enough a good quality data set.
And this is where it comes back to your risk assessment. Even the ICO says this across all of their guidance. The Health and Safety Executive says this across all of their guidance, is that it all revolves around you, your circumstances, and that initial risk assessment. Therefore, if you haven't done that, if you haven't looked at your demographic, your audience, your physical building, and what your requirements are, and then just do a finger in the air and want to do things perfectly, you're going to land yourself in trouble. There will be no solid fits here. Some of this will be square peg round hole, and that you do your best. And again, if you've looked at it correctly, you've asked the right questions, you've done things that are as close to a round hole as that square peg can go, then you're on a good path. But it doesn't mean that you're 100% infallible, because it's just not possible. The scheme's just it's not a legal mandatory scheme. There's lots of vague areas, and there will be people that do try and buck your system. So do you force everyone to be verified, even though you might get the odd one that bucks the system? is it worth the risk?
We have to move on from that because we do have a lot more slides. But you see our point here, I believe. Oh, come on, slides. Thank you. So I kind of threw together a bit of how would I create this template? And I was looking at, in the panic of trying to reopen, what is the best way that you can kind of get the information down? So I thought about it on a, let's do this list on a daily list, because that way you can slowly delete things as the 21 days lapses. And the things that I was looking at as I was entering data in as though I was filling it out was that picking a 24-hour clock so you know what time they were actually in the system, in your venue, and sticking to it. Looking at email or telephone, you only need to have one as long as you can get hold of them, so don't try and force two. Full name, not just first name. So as I said earlier about James Smith, Jenny, there might be more than one Jenny, but is James Smith not something that you can identify someone from because the name's too common? So just have a think about how you would do that. But also is that rotas, are you really going to want to go and have to investigate into your rotas when something happens that you find out one of your customers has got COVID now and you want to know who was in the building on that day? If you've got a list of who was on the rota today, also any contractors, as was mentioned, is that you've got literally a quick look at who was there all day. And also think about spelling mistakes and having data corrected, because when you're doing it on paper, it's a lot harder. But yes, try and do a new sheet every day. So Lynn's asking, do we know if test and trace people contact anyone by email? It's an option that they told us to create, to collect. So you can only hand over the data you're being told to collect. What do you think, Scott?
Well, apparently they are, but I've not seen any instances of it, because all the scam advice that I've done, as Jenny pointed out, has all been telephone related. So again, it's one of those, it's in the guidance that says that it's something that they could ask for. And again, if someone's booked online and the only thing you've got for them is a valid email address, then it's a valid method of contact. So I would say yes.
So if you choose to verify things, obviously you can have a column to say tick or cross as to verification. Or as Lynn pointed out about the library's guidance around its time from and to. So have a think about having a column separate for time arrival and time departure. This isn't by any stretch of the imagination this is how you should do it. It was simply me going, how would I do it if I was a person that was wanting to reopen my venue after a certain time? So I was thinking about sort of how could I do this with a lot of ease over and above making it too complicated that it's impossible, that you're spending too many hours trawling through the rest of your record. Earlier, keeping everything separate means that you can get rid of it a lot easier. And you can access it a lot easier.
So this is another area where, so the right of access, so once I've got something and I'm processing it, then the right of access is definitely something that applies pretty much regardless of your grounds of processing. Therefore, it's something that needs to be considered as well. And again, if all I've got, so if we look at the previous example, is all I've got is a name, date and time they were in, an email address or telephone number, and that's it. How do I then verify that the person that's rung me up saying I want a copy of what you've got on me, how do I verify that it was them? And again, it's going to be very context-based, very individual organisation-based, because if you're, say, a university, you've got ways of verifying that person A is person A on your systems. Whereas if you're a restaurant with just that and that's it, or a museum with just that and that's it, how do you verify them in any way? So some of it might be a degree of risk. Some of it might be well, I know they came in on this particular day, and my system that I've got, so I've got I don't know, a table booking system that assigns people to a particular table. I could then say as part of my verification, so could you tell me where you were sitting? And if they've got absolutely no idea, all right, that could be a warning flag. That could be a warning flag. Again, it's going to be very circumstantial based on your organisation and what they're asking for. But it is going to be risky. There's no two ways about it. There will be a scenario where they've ticked all the boxes. As far as you're concerned, it looks like it's them. Therefore, I am going to release to them this particular extract that says they were on this place at this time, this way. Again, providing you've asked the right questions or you've at least taken steps to try and verify them in some way, then the impact of that, yes, there is an impact. But again, the ICO would be hard pressed to say that you've done it wrong, because you've tried to verify them as much as possible. You've not just given it out, you've taken some reasonable steps. If someone's bucked your system and genuinely duped you, then there isn't much you can do to deal with the impact of that. But the key thing is to make sure that you do have some sort of verification process. Don't just go, oh, hi, Bob, you've said you're Bob. Hello, Bob, there's Bob's information, done. At least think about it. Try and put some things in place to make it a little bit more difficult so that I shouldn't be able to ring up and go, hello, my name was Bob and I want a copy of my information, please. And I'm just a random person on the end of the phone. I don't know why I did that. Everyone does that when they do phones. So, yeah. So again, that's something that you need to consider as to what would be appropriate for that sort of data, and make sure that, again, staff are trained to not just give it out on the phone and check and go, oh yes, I see you came in last Thursday. It's oh no, sorry, let me see if I can I take your details and I'll look into that for you. Whatever, something other than just giving it out.
But also on that side of things is that if you are going to give it out and you're happy with the person you're giving it to, make sure you redact it and take other people's data out. Don't just share the whole daily sheet. Please do cover up the people that have visited to your. They don't need to know who else was there on that day. Only provide the information about them. The slowness on this, Scott, is driving me crazy. Come on, giddy up. Okay, so we then start looking at use, which is interesting because we were already 55 minutes in and we've only just covered creation. But hopefully we should be able to go through this a lot more swiftly. If you guys do have to drop off at past, like I said, this is being recorded and you should be able to view it afterwards. Just keep an eye out for on mine and Scott's social media for sharing the link. So, Scott.
So this is where we talked about earlier on about, if you're going to collect it for one reason, make sure there are some sort of limits and controls on the fact that it's only used for that reason and that reason only. So if it's a paper-based system, again, pick out some of the security stuff. Perhaps it's locked away securely and looked after, and that way that it's not freely used. Only, say, a senior manager or the bar manager or the whatever, the landlord, whatever can access it, and that's it. Other than that, it gets locked away. And again, be clear with what you're telling people and avoid the temptation, because there will be a temptation where you're collecting a lot more data than what you've ever have done before to use it for a secondary purpose. So is there a way of restricting that in some way, be that physical control or a technical control, whatever, to stop it from being reused for a secondary purpose? A lot of that could even, because again, if you're not, so where it's being used on legitimate interests, someone may well exercise their right to restriction if they don't trust you or they think that you're going to send them marketing stuff. So again, being crystal clear with them, transparent with them up front, they're more inclined to be clear as to what should and what shouldn't. Next one is then the right of rectification, talking about accuracy. And again, make sure you've got a process for if you have taken down or a mistake has worked its way through and someone wants to edit it in some way, then again, have a process for just double checking that and say, oh, can you just tell me the number that you're ringing from? You wanted me to change it to this. Can I ring you back on that number? Those sorts of things, just to confirm that it's actually genuine. But make sure, because you will be heavily reliant on that original collection in the first place. So when you do get a mobile phone number in, if it's a physical process, get them to recheck it. Oh, you've just said your mobile number is this. Is that right? Those sorts of things. And again, factor into account the environment, because again, if I'm in a restaurant and there's a couple sat right there, 2 meters away, but still in hearing distance, and I shout rather loudly, "So your telephone number is this, is it?" Then you're going to land yourself in trouble as well. Sorry for those that have been on mute.
I have visions of someone going, "Oh, Dominic Cummings, your mobile is."
Just be sensible, just as you would, like you're in restaurants or whatever else. Waitresses are usually quite good about talking at a reasonable, or waiters, restaurants are usually quite good at talking at a reasonable level. Or just get them to show. I've captured your details down as this. Can you just confirm that? Those sorts of things, just little tweaks in behaviour that just make it far easier to manage and makes it less of a pain in the backside.
And in terms of confirming, don't show them the whole sheet when you're doing it. Could you just confirm that what I've written down is correct? And here's everybody else's mobile number at the same time. Your picture with your Starbucks kind of logo on it reminds me of the meme that said, "My name's Mark" with a K, and they wrote Kark. That's what I kept on chuckling about. So when things are in use, have a think about anything that's electronic. It will need a power supply over operating full out open hours. So think about that. Is that unfortunately, and I thought it was brilliant when you get it brand new out of the box, but as soon as you start using it, it soon starts to deteriorate. Staff will need to go on a break. Will it be left alone? Can you lock it away? Always have someone covering the entry to capture the information so that no one can walk in and not be captured. So keeping your integrity. Will it be legible? How good is your handwriting if you're writing it down? Will it be dogged and ripped so that you can't read it anymore? What happens if someone spills coffee on it? As it says here, is that if it's multiple people on the list, don't hand the document to the customers. They'll see everyone else's data that's been in the venue. And also, 1 day per page, what happens if you have think about keeping them together and on paper, because that seems to be the thing where with pubs and restaurants not being able to provide everybody with a laptop, that you do staple everything together for that one particular day and don't leave it unattended. And yes, just think about all the things that could go wrong and put something in place. Storage.
So again, where it is personal data, there is a degree of, again, appropriate security. And again, this is where a degree of common sense comes in, as Emily's just talked about, to say, well, what sort of things could go on? What environment have I got? Who's around? What sort of formats does it need to be in? Because again, the advice will chop and change based on what you're doing and how the pressures and technologies that you are using. So look at it. You know that I've got to, I've got to collect this stuff and I've got to keep it private. So what threats are there to that privacy? Is that people can see it? Is it staff go on breaks? All those sorts of things. Factor that into what you're doing. Next slide. Little things like, if it's paper records, keeping them locked away. If you do have a website that you're using for bookings, take a look at it. Has it been refreshed lately? What does your provider that you've bought it from say around its cybersecurity, stuff like that? Is it a reputable app? Reputable, whatever that means these days. App that you're using. Where are your terms and conditions? When did you last sign them? Do you even know where they are? All those sorts of things. And just make sure that you've got stuff in there. If you have been, and this is where it takes a little bit of honesty, if you have been using weak passwords for things that you don't for the duration, or you just don't do it anymore. In an ideal world, but again, in this world, for the duration, you actually have a proper password. those sorts of things. Just little things to go, well, if your world is changing and you're collecting in stuff that you've never had before, therefore your risk has widened, then accommodate and change accordingly. But again, be appropriate, think logically, think practically, things that staff get, they'll understand, they'll see the logic of doing, just as your customers will see the logic of doing as well. Part of that is also keeping a record of what you've done. So when you look to reopen, train your staff on everything that you've looked at here. So everything you agree that you want to put in place, make sure staff are fully trained up on it. Make sure they have the templates, the resources, the whatever it is that they need to do the job. Keep a record of that. This is what we told them. This is where it was. We know we've looked at our supplier for this particular thing, and this is where the contract is. That's fine. All those sorts of things. What's in your employment contract around data protection and confidentiality, those sorts of things. Is there anything in your employment contract about it? Those sorts of things. Just reminders to make it clear of what is acceptable and what isn't. And even just the threat of, we're watching you. This is a really sensitive time for all of us. Therefore, your temptation to, nick someone's personal data, as that Auckland story was, nick someone's personal data and use it for your own purposes. I've got my eye on you. That's not going to happen. That could be enough to deter them.
That was really creepy.
Thank you.
So, once you're finished with the end of the day, you think about various things. Who's responsible for locking it away? Where is it going to be kept? Is it a laptop people can log out of? Will you be taking it home with you? Is it stored in a place where no one else can access it? Is it accessible when needed? Would it be forgotten? Are you using a third-party supplier? I was just looking online recently, this morning, that someone has managed to pull together some kind of tracking system, and it's like, wow, they're really moving quick with this. Is it good enough? And naturally, their privacy policy was incorrect. But there you go. What are you going to do? So yeah, when you're storing it, especially things like will you take it home with you, think about if your house gets broken into, that it's in a locked cupboard away from windows and doors. Think about home working in your general business, keeping it separate and keeping it away and locked away and making sure that your family or any visitors can't get to it. And lastly, not quite lastly, review. We're looking at the retention being last action entry plus 21 days. You can make decision on whether or not you've had any reports of COVID. Even if you haven't, you can get rid of it. And even if you have, you should have already dealt with it. This personal data doesn't need to be kept. You should have other records that are in referencing to if you have to close down because of COVID or anything like that. You don't need the personal data from your daily lists to reference whether or not you should be keeping it. So 21 days really should be the maximum that we're looking at you keeping it.
It's worth, earlier on I put in a link to the HSE guidance on what would happen if you do get a large number of cases and who you can contact in your local authority, Public Health England, blah, 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 blah. And again, in there, it sets out expectations for what they would want from you and how that would work. So when it comes to what sort of records you'd need to keep, then that's one of the questions, if you've never dealt with them before, that you could ask them at that time as to what they want, what they're going to generate, those sorts of things. But again, it could be quite likely that you go nowhere near that. You might get the odd one case and that's it. So again, make it part of your toolkit when you cross that bridge. But otherwise, I wouldn't majorly worry about it. One of the other things you need to consider is then earn the right to erasure. So if someone does say during those 21 days, I want you to get rid of that information, can you do that? Can you not do that? Again, it's predominantly based on if it's no longer required. So after that 21 days, if you're being sneaky or have forgotten to do it and it's still there, you're going to have to get rid of it. But for the duration of those 21 days, again, you can make the strong argument, providing you have made the strong argument as part of your legitimate interests or as part of the public health Article 9 stuff, that again, it's not something that the right to object or right to erasure we could honour or even apply in the first place. But again, you've got to look at it from the word go, not just deal with it as when something comes up.
And then ultimately disposition. No, it doesn't need to go to archive, but yes, it does need to go onto your confidential waste. And yes, the 21-day retention only is official guidance. I believe it's probably something to do with the actual virus itself and how long it takes to generate. And 21 days ago, if you haven't got it already, then you're not going to get it from that particular day in which you visited your venue.
Yeah, the guidance for businesses says the 14-day incubation period plus a couple of days either side. So they've recommended 21 days as a safe buffer zone either side, and that's specifically called out. So if you look at the COVID-19 area on the government's website, the COVID-19 pages, where it's talking about guidance for businesses, all the guidance documents, and you can tell where they've copied and pasted all the way along, is it starts with, we recommend 21 days. But again, because this is a voluntary system and it's not set in national law or as a mandatory requirement, then it's just that makes logical sense. So that's something that we could back up logically because the government have recommended 21 days.
And people have been saying, I mean, if anyone's heard me talk before, you'll hear me talking about minimum retention periods for your retention schedule. I believe that this is a maximum, that you don't need to keep it any longer than 21 days to get rid. And that's also a good reason to keep it separate from anything else so that you can delete it after 21 days. If you're using a booking system that you can't delete out of because it's based on Microsoft Access, well, yeah, not good enough. Have a think about how you're actually going to delete it when you're putting it into a system. Can you just literally put it into a shredder as presented on the screen right now?
So yeah, there are some. So again, if you are getting more and more paper stuff in, if you used to use paper booking forms and you don't have a cross-cut shredder, as an example, perhaps now's the time. You've avoided doing it for a while, and now's the time to do it. Makes sense. It's useful no matter what goes on with your organisation, post-COVID and during COVID. Now's the time.
What you should be looking for with a cross-cut shredder is something with DIN 3 or DIN 4, and the DIN is in relation to how big or small that it cuts paper. DIN 3 is good enough for confidential, but for most part, DIN 4 is for secret information within government. So nothing less than DIN 3. And the higher you get, I believe it goes through to DIN 6 or 7, and that's basically dust. And anything less than DIN 3 is strip shred, and you could glue it back together again.
And again, the last time I bought one was a little while ago, but again, they're not massively expensive. So you're talking double figures rather than triple or quadruple figures. So again, a worthwhile investment if you are heavily reliant on paper in the first place. There are a couple of electronic systems that will help with the electronic deletion of data, but some of it might depend on the system that you've got, as Emily said before, because Access is known for not deleting stuff. If your online booking system doesn't delete stuff, or does but has a set retention and won't do anything else, then again, that's something that you need to consider as part of your risk assessment and what options that you've got, because it could be that you seek an alternative as just the easier option, those sorts of things. And then also then be aware, if you are storing it on certain systems, what do you do about your backups? Do you do backups at all? Those sorts of things to consider.
So we've come to the end. Hey, I'm sorry that we've run over, but we just had a lot to say, and we're just like, and with data protection, there is a lot of information, so it would feel remiss to not include everything. This is just a slide about who I am and sort of like having a think about me. rmgirl.co.uk is my website address. You can find my blog on there where I talk about various different information governance related things. Yes, that is a picture of me in that boiler suit, as I'm often found in that kind of situation to do with business continuity and disaster recovery. Having asthma means that I wasn't taking any risks with mold. Yeah, that's basically me, really. Is that if there's anything that I can help you with, information related, then do get in contact.
Similarly, my passion is data protection. Everything's on lighthouseig.com. I'm doing a lot of stuff for the Essex Chambers of Commerce for local businesses and local organisations in Essex. So I'm planning on releasing a lot more blogs, follow-up guidance and things like that, not only through the Chamber, but also supporting the Chamber via my website as well. So keep an eye on some of the stuff that we're looking at, because that will come out over the next couple of weeks, lighthouseig.com. Do
we have any more questions? Feel free to ask us them, whether we answer them or not.
I like that. Lynn's got extra 2 weeks because of a lockdown in Leicester.
Yes, interesting. In terms of feedback from our webinar today, we rely on the power of social media, unfortunately. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing how great you found this webinar and tagging us in it so that we can retweet about them, please do. If you'd like to see us again, also tell us that as well, because we could put up each other for the last 8 years, so we could do a couple more of these webinars together, I think. That's don't stare into the camera like that, Scott.
Oh, I was looking at the Esme's asked a question around. She missed the beginning bit where we talked about legal basis. So we had a little discussion about that. So the ICO is putting forward legitimate interests for Article 6 personal data, but as we highlighted, there might well be some scenarios where someone does declare, "Oh, I've got COVID-19. You need to do this." In which case, then we looked at the public health 9I, if I remember rightly. Let me double check that because I'm rubbish with numbers. Yeah, 9I. And for that, you also need a policy document as well. So it's worth being clear that someone will contact you to say, "Oh, I've had whatever. Therefore, you need to then start telling these people to self-isolate." So again, put that in there as well.
Oh, we've got definitely more webinars. You're putting up with me for a bit longer, Scott. So yes, this recording on my website hopefully soon, because I just got to do some editing. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us, and we shall see you again soon. Bye. I still have to wave for some reason. It's like I'm waving on Teams and Zoom and now on Livestorm. I give up. I'm just a friendly person.